"Forgive me," he says, his voice still a dry rustle, but stronger. "For the trouble. For the fear I must have brought to your door." The grandmother, rocking again with a slow, steady cadence, waves a dismissive hand. "Trouble walks in many boots," she says. "Some we choose, some choose us." The door was there. The light was lit. Her simplicity disarms him. He looks down into his ball, his throat working. "I had lost all direction," he confesses. Not to anyone in particular, but to the room, to the fire, as if giving voice to the memory might finally release its hold. The world became a white wall. There was no up, no down, just the cold pushing into me. He pauses, gathering the words like scattered stones. "My horse." I felt him panic. A great jerk on the reins, and then he was gone. The sound of his hooves was swallowed in an instant. The children listen. Their porridge forgotten. This is no longer a story from a book, it is a truth. Sitting by their fire, wrapped in their quilts, I thought if I kept moving, I would find something. A fence line, a tree, anything. But movement, it uses you up. It empties your heat into the void. His gaze fixes on the flames. I was ready to sit down, to let the snow make a shape of me. It would have been quiet. Profound silence fills the cabin, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. It is not an uncomfortable silence, but a respectful one, a space hollowed out for his confession. "Then," he says, and a faint, wondrous smile touches his lips. "Then, I saw the gold." He looks up, his eyes finding the lantern on the table, now extinguished in the morning light. A smear of gold, floating in all that white, like a fallen star. I didn't believe it at first. Thought it was my mind coming undone at the end. But I fixed my eyes on it. I told my legs, walk toward the gold. He lets out a long, slow breath. It was the hardest walking I have ever done. Each step was like lifting a mountain. But the gold, it didn't waver. It held. His eyes meet the mother's. "It was your window. Your lantern." He holds his gaze, and in that moment, a profound understanding passes between them, the giver and the receiver of a light that was never meant for such a purpose, yet served it perfectly. "The door," Thomas whispers. Finding the door in the blur, that was the last of my strength. The father, who has returned from his shoveling and stands stamping snow from his boots by the threshold, nods. "A light in a window is a promise," he says quietly. "We never know who might need to believe in it." The conversation lapses again into a comfortable quiet. The practicalities of the new day begin to gently press in. The father assesses their stores with a practiced eye. The mother boils more water, for tea, for washing, for the simple comfort of its steam. Thomas attempts to stand, swaying slightly, and the father is at his side in an instant, a solid support. "Easy," the father says. "The cold has taken its tax. It will demand payment and weakness for a few days yet." They help him to a proper chair by the fire, and he sinks into it with a sigh that is part exhaustion, part profound relief. The children, emboldened by the daylight and the stranger's improving color, begin to move about, their voices returning to normal tones. They peer out the cleared window, pointing at the fantastic shapes the wind has carved from the snowdrifts. "Look, a sleeping bear," the younger one exclaims, and indeed a vast rounded drift does suggest a slumbering creature. "A castle with spires," cries the other, and that, too, is there in the sweeping curves and sharp ridges. The storm has not just buried the world, it has reimagined it, offering a fresh canvas for young eyes. The grandmother watches them, her own eyes crinkling at the corners. "Every storm leaves a new world behind," she muses aloud. "The old one is hidden, waiting. This one is for wonder, for a little while." The day unfolds in this gentle, deliberate key. There is no thought of long travel or great labor. The scope of the world has shrunk, blessedly, to the path by the door, the woodpile under its mantle of snow, the visible breath of life in the cold air. The father, after his initial clearing, does not push further. He knows the frontier's first rule after a blizzard: respect the aftermath. He tends to the animals in the lean -2, a low structure half- buried beside the cabin, bringing them water and fodder, his presence a comfort to the confined creatures. The mother airs out bedding, the frozen fabric snapping stiffly before yielding to the indoor warmth. She prepares a simple stew for the midday meal, letting it simmer for hours, its rich smell becoming the enduring note of the afternoon. Thomas dozes in his chair, the deep, healing sleep of convalescence. When he's awake, he talks a little more. He speaks of a sister 2 days, ride south under normal conditions, whom he was trying to reach for the holiday. He speaks of his farm, smaller than theirs, and of a dog who would be whining fretfully at his neighbor's door, wondering at his absence. He is, piece by piece, reassembling the man he was before the white wall fell, integrating the harrowing night into his story. As the pale sun begins its early descent, painting the snow in shades of blue and lavender, a new feeling settles upon the cabin. It is the true essence of the day, the quiet heart of this frozen Christmas. It is not festivity, but profundity. Not jubilation, but a deep, humbled gratitude that vibrates at a frequency below sound. They gather for the evening meal as they had the night before, but everything is different. The storm is a tale now, not a threat. The stranger is a guest, not a casualty. The darkness outside is merely night, not an abyss. The meal is eaten with a sense of celebration, but one that is internal and serene. Afterwards, the mother does something unexpected. She goes to the small, humble shelf that holds their few books and retrieves a worn, leather-bound volume. It is not a Bible, but a book of poems and psalms, its pages softened by years of handling. He does not open it. She simply holds it in her lap as they all settle once more near the hearth. On this night, she begins, her voice soft but clear. We have a story of our own to add to the old ones. A story of a light that held, of a door that opened, of a dawn that was earned. She looks at Thomas, then at her children, her husband, the grandmother. We will remember this. When other winters come and other storms, we will remember that the light was seen, that the door was opened, and that the morning found us all here together. It is the only sermon, the only carol, that this frontier Christmas requires. The grandmother reaches out and places her wrinkled hand over the mother's. The father nods, his eyes reflecting the firelight. The children, understanding the gravity if not all the depth, sit perfectly still. Thomas bows his head, his shoulders shaking once, quietly, with the release of a burden he no longer needs to carry alone. Later, as Fold Ark embraces the quiet, snow-bound world, the lantern is lit once more and placed in the window. It is not a beacon of distress now, but a statement, a declaration that in this vast, frozen silence, life persists, warmth endures. A family and the stranger they have folded into their circle keep watch. They sleep that night not with the tense readiness of the night before, but with the bone-deep peace of those who have passed through a trial and emerge, scat, a cheat deep but whole on the other side. The blizzard of 1874 becomes a line in the family history, a story told on future winter nights. The Christmas of the Great Snow, they will call it. And the heart of the story will never be the storm's fury, but the quiet that followed. The path shoveled in the hushed morning, the taste of porridge sweetened with honey, the profound, speechless understanding in a stranger's eyes, the unshakable truth, learned in the deepest cold, that a light in a window is never just a light. It is a defiance. It is a hope. It is a promise whispered into the howling dark, that for those within its glow, and for any soul lost enough to find it, morning will always come. And so, in that profound silence after the storm's great voice had faded, a deeper story began to unspool. It was a story written not in words, but in the slow, deliberate rhythms of a day reclaimed. The morning bled into an afternoon of astonishing clarity, where the sky became a pale, flawless dome of porcelain blue. Sunlight, weak but unwavering, poured over the endless white sea, making the landscape not just bright, but luminous, as if the very snow held a light within it. This was the storm's final, paradoxical gift, a world of unbearable beauty, wrought from its own terrible violence. The family moved through this new reality with a kind of reverent purpose. Father's shovel-work had carved a small, civilized kingdom around the cabin, a path to the woodpile, a cleared space by the door, a narrow track to the lean-2. Beyond this, the wilderness began, pristine, untouched, and daunting in its silent immensity. The children, bundled into every piece of clothing they owned, were finally allowed to venture out. Their first steps into the chest-high drifts were comical and wondrous. They sank to their thighs, laughing with shock at the cold, then began the serious work of sculpting and exploring. Their voices, high and clear, were the only sounds in the vast auditory cathedral of the snow-blanketed plains. They found miracles everywhere: a frozen spider-bear strung between two buried fence posts, transformed into a necklace of diamonds; the delicate, feathery tracks of a bird that had braved the storm's tail; an ice-encrusted berry cluster on a buried bush, like a tiny jar of summer preserves forgotten in the cold. Inside, the cabin had shifted its nature. It was no longer a fortress under siege. It had become a museum of warmth, a gallery displaying the artifacts of survival and the quiet art of recovery. Thomas sat by the fire, a quilt around his shoulders, and undertook the slow task of mending. The mother had given him a torn harness strap and uneedled thread. It was simple and eminent work, but it served a vital purpose. It gave his hands a purpose, his mind a gentle focus away from the abyss he had so recently skirted. Each pull of the thread through the stiff leather was a reaffirmation of order, of utility, of a future where broken things could be made whole. The grandmother watched him, her own hands busy carding wool. The rhythmic scrape of the cards, the soft thump as she built the fluffy roll, was a sound as old as hearths themselves. "It is good," she said, not looking up from her work, "to use the hands that were almost lost. It reminds the spirit it is still tethered to the earth." Thomas nodded, a silent understanding passing between the young man and the old woman. He was not just mending leather, he was stitching himself back into the fabric of the ordinary, the daily. The mother, meanwhile, performed her own rituals of reclamation. He took down the frost-stiffened curtains and soaked them in a tub of meltwater. She swept the hearth, not just for ashes, but as a symbolic clearing. She sorted through their modest stores with a careful eye, planning the careful arithmetic of meals that would stretch until the deep snows receded enough for a trip to the distant settlement. Her movements were economical, graceful, a silent language of care that spoke of generations of women who had turned houses into homes on the very edge of the possible. The father returned from his outdoor chores, his beard frosted, his eyes watering from the glare. He brought in an armload of wood, the bark dusted with crystal snow that sparkled in the firelight before melting. He did not speak of the immense solitude outside, of the tracks HED scene that spoke of a hungry coyote circling far off, of the way the sheer scale of the white expanse could humble a man to silence. Instead, he spoke of practicalities. The snow's packed deep, but it's settling. Another day or two of sun, and a horse might manage it. Well, see, his words were not a plan, but a seed of possibility planted in the quiet room. The day wore on, marked by the slow migration of sunlight across the plank floor. As the brilliant blue outside began to deepen towards indigo once more, a subtle shift occurred within the cabin. The activities of repair and maintenance gradually yielded to a collective stillness. The children came in, pink, cheeked and sparkling with melted snow, their wonder now tempered by a pleasant exhaustion. They sat close to the fire, steaming gently, and listened as the adults spoke in low tones. The conversation was not of the storm, but of things before and after it. Thomas spoke of his sister's homestead, of her skill at cheese making, of her two sons who were desperate for a pony of their own. The father spoke of the spring planting he envisioned, of a new field he aimed to break to the west. The mother and grandmother shared memories of Christmases past a scent of cinnamon somehow procured. The era traveler brought a single orange as a gift, the deep, resonant sound of a church bell heard across miles of silence known a childhood long gone. These were not just stories, they were lifelines cast across time, connecting this isolated moment to a continuum of life, of hope, of continuity. They were asserting, in the face of the overwhelming white silence outside, that their story did not begin with this blizzard, and would not end with it. As twilight gathered, the mother lit the lantern early and once again placed it in the window. This time, Thomas watched the ritual with new eyes. He saw not just a practical light, but a symbol, a covenant. "It feels like a prayer," he said softly, almost to himself. The grandmother, rocking in the gathering shadows, nodded. "It is a prayer of thanks, and a prayer for others. You never know whose eyes are searching the dark." Night fell, but it was a different night than the last. This darkness was soft, velvety, friendly. The wind was a bare whisper, just enough to make the eaves sigh companionably. The cold was still profound, a tangible presence beyond the walls, but it had lost its malevolent, seeking intelligence. It was merely winter being winter. The family ate a simple supper, and the mood was one of deep, unspoken contentment. The storm had burned away all non-minus essentials, leaving behind only the core elements: shelter, warmth, food, and the immutable value of the person sitting across from you. Later, as the fire burned down to a bed of pulsating coals that painted the room in shades of rose and copper, the mother brought out the book again. This time she opened it. She did not read aloud, but her fingers traced the lines of print, her lips moving silently. It was a private devotion, yet its very performance was a public affirmation, a declaration that in this rough cabin, on this remote frontier, the world of thought, of spirit, of written word, was still honored. One by one, they prepared for sleep. The children, truly weary now from their day of snow, fell asleep almost as soon as they were tucked into their corner. Thomas was given a proper pallet by the fire, and he lay down with a groan that was more satisfaction than pain. Father banked the fire with meticulous care, building a nest of coals that would last till morning. He then walked to the window and stood for a long moment, looking out at the blackness punctuated only by the steady, golden eye of their lantern. He saw his own faint reflection in the glass, and behind it the warm, dim room, his wife rolling wool with his mother, the sleeping children, the rescued stranger. He placed his hand flat against the cold pane, a silent allude to the enduring peace within. Finally, the grandmother rose. She moved to each sleeping child, adjusting a blanket, brushing a strand of hair from a forehead. She paused by Thomas' pallet and looked down at him for a long moment, her face unreadable in the dim light. Then she bent, with a slight stiffness, and laid the quilt she had been working on all day over him. It was not a spare blanket. It was the one from her own bed, its patches a history of the family. It was the ultimate act of welcome, then folding him into their story. She then returned to her chair but did not rock. She simply sat, watching the coals, a living statue of vigilance and peace, until her own eyelids finally grew heavy. The cabin slept, but it was a watchful sleep, a collective, grateful repose. The storm of 1874 was over. In its wake, it left more than just snow. It left a quiet so deep it seemed audible. It left a family whose bonds had been tempered in the coldest forge. It left a stranger who was a stranger no longer, but a living testament to the consequence of a single, unwavering light. And it left this truth echoing in the silent hearts of all who slept within those log walls that on the farthest frontier, under the most brutal sky, the most powerful force was not the blizzard's scream, but the quiet, persistent glow of a window in the vast and waiting dark. The story does not end with the dawn, for dawns are common. It ends here in this deep, earned peace, with the gentle breath of sleepers, the whisper of settling embers, and the unblinking lantern keeping its faithful watch, a small, brave star anchored to the earth, holding its own against the infinite night. Dawn, when it came again, was a quieter affair, a gradual softening of the black vault into a deep, bruised purple, then a wash of cool gray. The silence was no longer absolute. It was a canvas upon which the new day began to paint its subtle sounds. The soft pop of a timber contracting in the returning cold, the faint, crystalline patter of snow, loosened by a hint of warmth, sliding from a branch in the distant, unseen grove. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life resumed, not with the urgency of survival, but with the gentle cadence of a world restored to itself. The father was the first to stir. He rose in the pre-dawn gloom, moving by memory and touch, and knelt before the hearth. With careful hands, he coaxed the banked coals back to life, breathing softly on the embers until a tiny tongue of flame licked up, hungry and new. This act, performed 1,000 times, felt different today. It was not the lighting of a defensive fire, but the kindling of a day like any other a profound luxury. By the time the others awoke to the smell of smoke and the gentle light now filling the room, a pot of water was already steaming. The mother moved to the window, rubbed a clear space with her sleeve, and looked out. The world was still a sculpture of white, but the sharp, wind-carved edges had softened overnight, rounded by the subtle kiss of a slightly warmer air. "It holds," she murmured, more a statement of fact than observation. The storm's kingdom was stable, but it was beginning imperceptibly to yield. Thomas was sitting up on his pallet, stretching his limbs with a cautious deliberateness. The stiffness was still there, a deep seated ache in his bones, but the terrifying numbness was gone. Keeler had returned to his face, and his eyes, when he met the mother's gaze, were clear and focused. "Another day," he said, and the words were a simple, breathtaking celebration. The grandmother, already in her chair with a shawl about her shoulders, nodded. "A day to mend. A day to breathe. A day to simply be." The morning unfolded as a mirror to the previous one, yet its reflection was subtly altered. The children's exploration of the snow was less about astonished discovery and more about proprietorship. They began building a fort in the lee of the cabin, their small mittened hands packing snow into walls, their negotiations on plans a bright, chattering counterpoint to the immense quiet. Their play was the first true declaration that normality had returned. The father ventured further today. With a long pole to test the depth of the drifts, he walked a slow circuit around the homestead's perimeter. He checked the integrity of the outbuildings, traced the line of their buried fence, and stood for a long while at the edge of their cleared land, looking south. He was not just assessing damage, he was mapping his world, reconciling the familiar mental image of his property with this new, temporary geography. He returned with a report of small things. The chicken coop had weathered well, a corner of the tool stroof bore a heavy load but seemed sound. The tracks of deer or perhaps antelope threaded through the distant trees, seeking forage. These were the headlines of their shrunken universe, and they were received with keen interest. The real work of the day was internal, a knitting together of lives. Thomas, his strength returning, insisted on contributing. He was given the task of chopping kindling in the small cleared space by the door. The repetitive thwack of the hatchet, the clean split of the dry wood, was a sound of vigorous health. With each swing, he was not just making fuel, he was dismantling the memory of his own helplessness, rebuilding himself as a man of use. The mother and grandmother worked side by side at the table, a pile of mending between them. A torn shirt cuff, a sock worn thin at the heel, the harness strap Thomas had finished. Their needles flashed in the window light, moving an undoubt of the fabric in a silent, intimate dance. They spoke little, but their silence was companionable, woven through with the shared understanding of women who have long labored to make things last. In these quiet hours, a new dynamic settled upon the cabin. The sharp, urgent bonds formed in the crisis were annealing into something warmer, more durable. Thomas was no longer a patient, nor merely a guest. He was becoming a temporary member of the household's economy, sharing in its tasks and its rhythms. He listened to the father's plans for the spring, offering a perspective from a different plot of land. He made the children laugh with the story of his dog's comical hatred of snow. He asked the grandmother about the patterns in her quilts, and she told him the provenance of each scrap of cloth and emery attached to every square. He unspoken agreement. The storm itself was seldom mentioned directly. Its shadow was present in the aching muscles, in the respectful glances at the stacked firewood, in the unconscious habit of everyone to glance at the lantern at dusk. But to dwell on it would have been to give the past too much power over this fragile, precious present. They spoke, instead, of the future. A future that was now imminent. As the second day wore on, the discussion turned, inevitably unpractically, to Thomas' journey home. "Sister," he said, staring into his cup of brewed pine-needle tea, "she'll be fearing the worst. And my neighbor, with my animals." The father nodded, studying the sky through the window. The snow's settling. The crust will harden again tonight. Tomorrow. With care, a horse could make a start. The statement hung in the air. It was a door opening. A path leading away from the insular world. There was no celebration in it, only a sober recognition of necessity. The mother quietly began to prepare. She packed a small sack with provisions, hard biscuits, a wedge of cheese, strips of dried venison. It was not much, but it was enough for a day or two of careful travel. Father went to the -2 and spent time with their own horse, a sturdy bay gelding, checking its hooves, brushing its coat, speaking to it in low, steady tones. He was preparing the animal, but he was also preparing himself for the act of lending it, an act of trust that extended their kindness beyond their own walls. That evening, the mood was bittersweet, a gentle melancholy woven into the fabric of their contentment. They shared a final supper, a slightly larger stew enriched with the last of the stored potatoes. The conversation was lighter, touched with an awareness of impending parting. Thomas told more tales of his homestead, his voice painting pictures of a different set of hills, a different creek, a life that ran parallel to theirs. He was, in a way, reintroducing himself as the man he was outside of this crisis, saying Aber, a fellow struggler against the soil and the seasons. When the meal was done, the mother did not bring out the book. Instead, the grandmother began to speak. Her voice was like the sound of the wind through dry grass, soft and full of stories. She did not tell a tale of adventure or rescue. She told a simple story of a seedling oak, buried by a landslide one harsh spring, that spent a year in darkness before a shift in the earth allowed a single shaft of light to reach it. How it must have held that light inside, she murmured, her eyes on the fire. Not fighting the dark all around, but treasuring the one slender beam. And that was enough. It grew toward that light, slow and twisted, but it grew. It became a tree that knew the value of a single sunbeam better than any other in the forest. No one said anything when she finished. The story sank into the room, a parable for each of them. For Thomas, the light was the lantern. For the family, it was the shared will to endure. For all of them, it was this moment, this fragile human connection in the vastness. Later, as they prepared for sleep on this last shared night, the father took Thomas aside. He handed him a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. Prince, the father said simply, and a stub of a candle. Keep them dry. You'll have the lantern, but a man should have a second light of his own making. Thomas took the parcel, his throat tight. It was not just a gift of fire. It was a gift of agency, a restoration of his ability to be his own savior. He could only nod, clasping the father's forearm in a grip that spoke volumes. The night passed, deep and still. In the morning, under a sky of hard, brilliant blue, the practicalities of departure took over. The horse was saddled, the provisions secured. Thomas stood at the cabin door, dressed in his own clothes, which had been dried and aired, the worst of the frost minus broken threads mended by the mother's needle. He looked from face to face, imprinting them once more. Thank you seemed too small a thing to say, so he said it with his whole bearing, with the straightness of his back, the clarity in his eyes, the firm set of his mouth. Your sister's place is southeast, just beyond the Twin Bluffs, the father said, pointing across the ocean of snow. The trail will be buried, but aim for that notch on the horizon. The horse knows to find footing. Go slow. Thomas nodded, then turned to the children. He crouched down, wincing only slightly. Keep building that fort, he said. He get the strongest one on the frontier. They nodded solemnly. He rose, and his gaze found the grandmother. She offered a slow, deep nod, a blessing without words. Finally, he looked at the mother. He stepped forward and pressed the small food sack into his hands, her own closing over his for a brief, warm moment. Travel safe, she said. Tell your sister, tell her you found a warm fire on Christmas Eve. I know, sweeping look at the cabin. Its smoke a pale gray thread against the endless blue. Thomas turned the horse and set out. The family stood on the porch, watching as man and beast became a dark, slow moving speck against the blinding white, tracing a fragile line toward the distant notch in the land. They watched until the speck disappeared into the glittering expanse. The silence, their own familiar silence, settled back around them. It was different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of a story completed. A thread had been pulled from their tapestry, sent out into the world, carrying a part of them with it. The father put an arm around the mother's shoulders. The children, sensing the solemnity, leaned against their parents. The grandmother, from her chair in the doorway, spoke softly to the empty, sun-drenched world. "Go with the light," she whispered. Then she turned her face to the sun, closed her eyes and smiled. And then they were for again. The profound quiet that followed the departure was not an emptiness, but a fullness settling back into its natural shape. The space Thomas had occupied by the hearth was now just a rectangle of sun-warmed floorboards, but it seemed to hold the impression of his presence like a fossil of recent memory. The family moved through the rest of that day with a soft, reflective energy. The tasks were the same: chopping wood, tending the fire, mending, preparing meals, yet each action felt imbued with a new significance. They were not just sustaining life, they were ending the embers of an experience that had irrevocably altered the atmosphere of their home. The father worked on the snow-path, widening it now from a trail into a proper yard. Each shovel of snow he tossed was not just clearing space, but integrating the storm's aftermath into the usable geography of their lives. He found himself pausing, leaning on the shovel handle, and looking south. He was not looking for Thomas. The man and horse were long gone into the glittering distance. He was looking at the land itself, with a renewed understanding of its dual nature, its breathtaking beauty, and its absolute indifference. It was a humbling, strangely peaceful realization. Inside, the mother took down the heavy winter curtains she had washed and began the slow process of hanging them. As she smoothed the fabric, now softened and clean, she thought not of the cold they kept out, but of the light they softened when drawn at night, the same light that had been a beacon. Her chores became a silent liturgy of gratitude for walls, for windows, for the simple power of a barrier against the infinite. The children, after a period of subdued quiet, returned to their snow fort. But their play had evolved. It was no longer just a construction. It was now a stave for a new story. The older child declared the fort a way station for lost travelers, and they began stocking a niche in the wall with pretend supplies: pinnacle biscuits, icicle daggers, packets of snow-medicine. They were unconsciously externalizing the narrative they had lived, turning their trauma into a game, which is the ancient, wise way of children to master the world. The grandmother observed it all from her chair by the window, her hands still but her eyes missing nothing. She saw the father's contemplative gaze, the mother's reverent touch, the children's symbolic play. She saw the family metabolizing the event, digesting the fear and the wonder, turning it into the strength of story that would become part of their bones. Later, as the short day began to wane, the mother did something she had not done since before the storm. From a high shelf, she brought down a small tin box. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of velvet, was a Christmas ornament. It was a simple thing, a blown-glass bird with a faded red breast, brought from a world of cobblestone streets and crowded churches across an ocean and a continent. It was too fragile for the rough branches of a pine bough, so each year she simply set it on the mantelpiece where it would catch the firelight. He had forgotten it in the storm's urgency. Now she carefully unwrapped it and placed it on the smooth stone of the hearth's edge. The children gathered round, their eyes wide at this tiny, elegant artifact from a mythical before. "It's a robin," the mother said softly. "Where I come from, some say seeing a robin in winter is a sign of hope arriving." The glass bird, with its fire-lit glow, became a new focal point. It was not a religious symbol, but a human one, a token of continuity. A fragile, beautiful claim that even here on the raw edge of the world, there was room for something beyond pure utility. That night, when the lantern was lit and placed in the window, its purpose felt multi-layered. It was still a prayer, as Thomas had said. It was still a promise of warmth within. But now it was also a memorial, a silent signal acknowledging the thread that had connected them to a stranger, and the path that thread had taken out into the white expanse. They slept deeply, the kind of sleep that follows not exhaustion, but completion. Days unspooled, each one a little longer, a little brighter. The sun gained strength, and the snow began its slow, granular surrender. A crest formed each night, a crystalline skin that would hold a man's weight for a few morning hours before softening into midday slush. The world began to leak sounds, the musical drip minus drip from the cabin's eaves, the distant boom of a snow slide from a hillside, the returning caw of a crow exploring the rain-minus emerging landscape. Life expanded its borders back to the far woodpile, to the frozen creek, to the horizon line that slowly, stubbornly, revealed the familiar silhouettes of distant but sun-tree lines. One afternoon, perhaps a week after Thomas' departure, the father was mending a harness in the late sun when he stopped, his head cocked. The children heard it to and fro in their play. From the south, a sound not the wind, but a steady, rhythmic percussion. Hoofbeats. They came on slowly, carefully, the crunch of pack snow and dice. A rider emerged from the glittering haze of reflected sunlight. It was not Thomas. It was a woman, bundled thickly, her face wrapped in a scarf, leading a second horse, the father spake gelding. The family gathered on the porch, not in fear, but in a quiet, expectant stillness. The woman drew up before the cabin and pushed back her scarf. Her face was wind-minus burned, her eyes the same clear gray as Thomas, etched with lines of recent worry and dawning relief. "I am Eleanor," she said, her voice rough from the cold air. "Thomas' sister." She dismounted, her movements stiff. "The horse, he came home safe." "My brother," her voice caught, and she looked at them, her gaze sweeping over their faces, their home, the lantern minus less window in the daylight. "He told me of the light, of the door." That was all she needed to say. The mother stepped forward first, breaking the stillness. "Come in," she said, her words a warm vapor in the cold air. "Please, come in and get warm." The cabin absorbed another stranger, but this time the welcome was different. It was not the urgent, clinical mercy extended to a half-minus frozen man, but the generous, open-minus-handed hospitality offered to an honored guest. Eleanor sat in Tom's spot by the fire, accepting a cup of hot broth. Surrey tumbled out in fits and starts, punctuated by sips from the cup and grateful glances around the room. She told of her error during the blizzard, knowing her brother was out in it, of the unbearable waiting, the miraculous moment, 2 days after Christmas, when he had staggered into her yard, leading the tired horse, pale and worn but whole. She spoke of his account, which he had given haltingly, still shaking not from cold, but from the aftershock of grace. He described this place, Eleanor said, her eyes shining, the log with the knot like an owl's eye by the door, the red checkered cloth on the table, the sound of the grandmother's chair. She looked at the rocking chair empty for the moment. He said it was the sound of a heartbeat, when he had forgotten his own was beating. He had come, she explained, to return the horse, of course, but more than that, she had come to see, to put her eyes on the lantern, the hearth, the faces of the people who had become, in her mind, angels of the prairie. She had brought gifts, a small wheel of her own yellow cheese, a jar of wild plum preserves, a pair of wool socks she had knit. They were simple things, but in the economy of the frontier, they were treasures, offered in profound reciprocity. The visit was brief. The days were still short, the travel slow and demanding, but for an hour, the cabin was filled with a new kind of warmth, the warmth of a story completing its circle. It was the echo returned, the proof that an act of kindness does not vanish into the void, but ripples outward, touching shores unseen. Before she left, Eleanor stood on the porch and looked back at the cabin. She looked at the mother, the father, the children peeking from behind them, the grandmother now standing in the doorway. "I will tell my children," Eleanor said, her voice firm with promise, "and they will tell theirs, about the Christmas the light held." Then she was gone, a smaller, solider figure retracing the path her brother had taken, leaving their world to return to her own. This second departure left no melancholy, only a deep, settled peace. The thread had not been cut, it had been tied off, securing a connection between two homesteads that would now exist in each other's stories forever. Winter loosened its grip, as winter must. The snows melted, revealing the frozen earth, then the mud, then the first brave green shoots. The world returned to its familiar browns and grays and nascent greens. The lantern still went in the window each night, but its glow now seemed to light the ordinary path from barn to house, to welcome the familiar stars. The story of the great blizzard began its transformation from lived experience into family lore. It would be told on future winter nights, the details polishing smooth with each telling. But the heart of it, the terror and the stillness, the stranger at the door, the profound quiet of the Christmas dawn would remain sharp and clear. Years later, long after the children had grown and the grandmother's chair sat empty, a traveler might stop at a homestead for water, and perhaps, over a shared meal, an old man with eyes the color of a winter sky would point to a simple, unadorned lantern gathering dust on a high shelf. That lantern, he might say, his voice soft, one Christmas Eve, during the big blow of '74, it saved a man's life. My father put it in the window, and the traveler would nod, thinking it a good story, a frontier tale. For the man telling it, it would not be just a story. It would be the quiet central truth of his childhood. At night the world went white and howled at the door, and the light inside did not flicker. The night they learned that the smallest, most ordinary things lantern, a door, a bowl of broth, the sound of a rocking chair could, when gathered around a human heart, hold back the coldest dark, and that, in the end, was the only magic that mattered. The spring that followed was not merely a season, it was an exhalation. A great, slow breath released from the frozen earth, carrying the scent of wet soil, of rotting leaves giving themselves back to the roots, of sap rising like a secret tide in the veins of cottonwoods. The snow retreated in patchwork stages, revealing not the remembered autumn ground, but something new, a landscape washed clean, scoured raw, and pregnant with potential. The immense silence of the snowbound weeks gave way to a chorus of rebirth. First, the drip of meltwater from the cabin's eaves, a constant, a rhythmic percussion that filled the days and lulled the nights. Then, the gurgle of the creek, tentative beneath a lattice of rotten ice. Then confident, then roaring with snowmelt from distant hills. Bird song returned, not the solitary, brave notes of midwinter, but a riotous, territorial chatter as bluebirds and finches laid claim to fence posts and budding branches. The family emerged from their cabin like seedlings pushing through loam. Their world, which had shrunk to the dimensions of firelight and shoveled paths, expanded violently, joyously. The children were the first to truly shed the winter skin. They shed their heavy layers with abandon, their boots squelching in the mud with a glorious, filthy delight. They rediscovered the world inch by inch. The slick, cold stones of the creek bed the first fuzzy catkins on the pussy willow, the skeleton of a deer, picked clean by scavengers during the hard months, now a sun-bleached map of bone. Their snowfort melted into a slumped, crystalline ruin, and they did not mourn it. They turned their attention to building a dam across a rivulet, their hands numb with cold water, their laughter carrying on the sharp spring air. For the father, the work was profound and physical. He walked the boundaries of his land, his boots sinking into the softened earth. He assessed the winter's damage, a section of fence flattened by a snow-drift's weight, the roof of the tool sagging where a supporting beam had groaned under the load. But his eye was drawn, as to the damage and more to the promise. The soil, freed from its icy carapace, looked dark and rich. He would feel its texture between his fingers, cold and crumbling, and envisioned the furrows he would soon cut, the seeds he would bury. The storm had been a kind of plow, he realized, breaking and resetting the land. His labor now was not repair, but collaboration. The mother's domain shifted from the inward-focused circle of the hearth to the outward-reaching life of the homestead. She aired every blanket, every quilt, hanging them on lines where they snapped in the wind, releasing the last ghosts of wood smoke in closed rooms. She scrubbed the cabin's plank floor until the wood grain showed pale and clean. Her hands, which had spent the winter mending and soothing, now turned to planting. In the small, south-facing plot by the cabin, she worked the earth, setting in the hardy starch she had nurtured on the windowsill during the last gray days of winter. Tiny sentinels of kale and cabbage. Her work was an act of faith, a bet placed against the lingering frost that still nipped at the nights. The grandmother spent long hours on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the lingering chill. She did not work with her hands as much, but her presence was a kind of work. She was the witness, the keeper of the continuum. She watched the children's muddy explorations, the father's surveying gaze, the mother's precise planting. She watched the land itself wake up. Sometimes she would simply close her eyes and turn her face to the sun, a faint smile on her lips, as if listening to a story the thawing earth was whispering only to her. Thomas and his sister Eleanor were not forgotten. They were present in absence, a part of the story that had become woven into the fabric of the place. The cheese had been eaten, the preserves savored on rare occasions, the wool socks worn. But more than the gifts, it was the connection that lingered. The father, while checking a far fence line, found a cairn of stones piled neatly at the corner post, a marker he knew from a neighbor clarifying a boundary. But in his mind, he saw Thoma's hand, steady now, placing those stones. The world felt less empty knowing that over the southern rise, there was a homestead where their names were spoken with gratitude. One evening, as the twilight stretched longer and a peeper frog began its tentative chirping from the creek, the family sat on the porch. The air was cool but carried the soft, green breath of growing things. No one spoke for a long time. They simply listened to the evening settle. The father finally broke the silence, his voice quiet. The ground will be ready for the east field in a week, maybe less. It was an ordinary statement, the most ordinary of all, a plan for the future. The mother nodded, her eyes on the first fireflies winking like lost stars in the tall grass by the creek. He'll mate to thin the carrot seedlings tomorrow. The children, drowsy against their parents, murmured about the tadpoles they'd seen in a shallow pool. The grandmother rocked slowly, the old chair creaking a familiar, comforting song. Then, almost as an afterthought, the mother spoke again. I saw a robin today, a real one, on the fence post by the garden. They all turned to look at her. The tiny glass bird still sat on the mantel inside, but this was different. This was life returned. The father smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. There you have it, he said. No more needed to be said. The robin was both a fact and a symbol, a simple creature going about its business, and a confirmation of the cycle. Winter, no matter how fierce, gives way. Darkness, no matter how deep, is broken by a single stubborn point of light. The frontier did not care about their story. The wind would still blow, the droughts would still come, the winters would still test them. But they had learned something in the crucible of that Christmas blizzard that no future hardship could erase. They had learned that their strength was not just in their logs and their firewood, but in the quiet space between them, in the willingness to open a door, in the act of placing a lantern in a window, not knowing who might see it, but trusting that its purpose to push back the dark was reason enough. The night deepened around them, velvet and soft. From inside the cabin, the glow of the fireplace spilled out through the open door, a warm, golden rectangle painted on the dark earth of the yard. It was not the desperate, defensive light of the storm. It was a domestic light, a light of supper dishes and bedtime stories of simple, earned peace. The father stood, stretched, and put a hand on his wife's shoulder. Time to light the lantern, he said. He went inside, struck a match, and touched it to the wick. The flame caught, steadied, grew. He did not place it in the window. Not tonight. Instead, he carried it to the porch and set it on the wide railing. It burned there, a small, brave sun in the vast, friendly dark, illuminating their faces, the faces of those who had stayed, and who would stay, through all the seasons to come. They sat there a while longer, in a silence that was full, not empty, full of the creek's song, the peeper's chirp, the rustle of a nocturnal creature in the grass, full of the memory of howling wind, and the profound gratitude for its absence, full of the unshakable knowledge, written in firelight on their faces, that they were here, together. And the long, gentle journey of their lives on that quiet sweep of land continued, one peaceful breath at a time, under the watchful, indifferent, and beautiful stars. And so, the story does not end, but dissolves. It melts into the rhythm of days that were no longer defined by a single, searing event. The blizzard of 1874 receded, not from memory, but from the foreground of daily life, became a seam in the fabric of their history, a strong, thick thread woven into the cloth, felt but not always seen. The homestead moved to the cadence of the sun in the soil. The father broke the earth of the east field, the plow shearing through the damp, fragrant loam, turning over a darkness that smelled of life and decay. The children followed behind, their small hands tasked with picking stones, each one a cold, smooth weight deposited in the growing pile at the field's edge, ache airing of future walls, of cleared land. The mother's garden became a tapestry of green, rows of peas and beans stitching themselves up twined trellises, and as forming tight, cool rosettes in the shade of the cabin wall. She would stand at its edge in the early morning, a cup of chicory coffee warming her hands, and watch the dew diamond the spitterbear strung between the stalks. The grandmother's domain was the porch in the patch of sunlight that traveled across its planks. She sorted seeds for next year, her fingers, gnarled but deft, separating poppy from marigold. She told stories not always of storms, but of her girlhood river, of the taste of a specific berry long extinct in her own land, of the way her own mother's laugh had sounded. She was the archive, and the children were her most devoted scholars. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and industry. Hay was cut, its sweet, sun-baked scent layering over the smell of dust and warm pine. The creek shrank to a clear, shallow ribbon over polished stones, and the children's play shifted to its banks, building rock and mud kingdoms for frogs, their legs browned by the sun. The world was abundant, demanding, and forgiving in its own way. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the southern track, not in the desperate blur of a storm, but in the clear, dust-hazed light of high summer. It was Thomas. He rode up to the cabin, not as a spectral figure of ice, but as a neighbor. Was leaner, tanned by the sun, his movements easy in the saddle. He dismounted and removed his hat, his smile broad and genuine. He had come to help with the haying, he said. His labor in return for a life was not a debt, but a choice, the continuation of a conversation begun in the dark. And so he worked, alongside the father. He swung a scythe in the shimmering heat, the blades whispering through the grass in long, rhythmic arcs. He drank deeply from the water jug the children carried out, water so cold from the springhouse it made his teeth ache. He ate lunch in the shade of the wagon with the family, bread and cheese and slices of cool cucumber from the mother's garden. The conversation was of crops and weather, of a new calf on his place, of the persistent groundhog and the mother's beans. The night of the blizzard was not mentioned. It was there, in the easy silence between them, in the way Thomas knew where to find the extra whetstone without asking, in the way the father handed him the dipper without looking up. It was in the foundations, unseen but essential. When the day's work was done and the last load was stacked in the barn, fragrant and golden, they ate supper on the porch as the fireflies emerged. Thomas told them of his sister, Eleanor, of her thriving garden, of her boys who talked of nothing but the miracle cabin to the north. He spoke of the ordinary, sturdy progress of his own life. He was building a room onto his house, he said. He had cleared a new pasture. He had, with great ceremony, gotten a new dog, a shaggy, cheerful creature who was terrified of thunder. As he spoke, the family could see it not a life saved, but a life lived, unfolding in all its mundane, glorious detail. That was the true gift they had given him, not just another sunrise, but all the sunrises that followed, each with its own chores and wonders. He left the next morning with the promise to return when the apples were ripe for pressing. And he did. And so, a pattern was established, a thread woven back and forth across the miles between the homesteads. Sometimes he came for work, sometimes simply to sit and share a meal. Sometimes Eleanor came with him, her presence adding a new, warm note to the gatherings. The children came to know them as an Ellie and Uncle Thomas, titles earned not by blood, but by the deeper kinship of shared survival. The frontier, for all its vast and lonely reputation, began to feel peopled, connected by these thin, strong lines of mutual regard. Seasons turned. The children grew, their limbs lengthening, their understanding of the world deepening. The story of the blizzard was something they knew, like they knew the taste of well water or the call of a hawk. It was part of their landscape. The older child, now a young man with his father's steady gaze, would sometimes take the old lantern down on a winter's evening, polish its glass, and light it, not for need, but for remembrance. The younger, with her mother's careful hands, began her first quilt, choosing fabrics that held her own memories, a scrap from a childhood dress, a square from Thomas' worn outwork shirt, a cheat he left for patching. The grandmother's rocking chair finally fell still. On autumn evening, as the maples blazed like torches around the cabin, she simply closed her eyes at the end of a story and did not open them again. Her passing was a deep sorrow, but not a harsh one. It was like the falling of a great, old tree in the forest, a space open to the sky, a return. They buried her on a rise overlooking the creek, under an oak's sapling they had transplanted together years before. The father and mother grew older, their hair silvering at the temples, their movements a fraction slower, but their partnership only deepened, worn smooth and strong like river stones. One crisp December evening, many years after the great snow, the now grown children were visiting with families of their own. The cabin was full of noise and warmth, the shrieks of grandchildren, the smell of baking pies, the layered hum of generations talking over one another. After the meal, as the youngest were settled into sleep pallets, the conversation turned, as it sometimes did on winter nights, to stories of the old days. The mother, her hair a soft white cloud, looked at Thomas, who was visiting for Christmas, his own beard now fully gray. "Tell them," she said softly, her eyes on the fire. "Tell them about the light." Thomas leaned forward, the firelight carving the lines of his face, lines of laughter and wind and sun. He did not begin with the storm. He began with the loneliness of the ride, with the beauty of the frost that morning, with the way his horse's breath had plumed in the still air. He built the world as it was, ordinary and peaceful, so that the children and grandchildren could feel the awful shock of its disintegration. He spoke of the white wall, of the loss of direction, of the cold that was not just an absence of warmth, but a positive, consuming force. He spoke of the despair, clean and simple as a knife. And then he described the gold. His voice dropped, became reverent. "A smear of light," he said, "hazy like a dream, but it held. It didn't flicker. It didn't waver. And off that moving, screaming weight, it was the only thing that stood still." He described the door, the faces that were not fearful but determined, the hands that pulled him in, the unbearable, exquisite pain of returning warmth. He told them of the grandmother's voice, of the children's solemn eyes, of the broth that tasted like life itself. He told them of the long night, of the cabin's song, of the dawn that felt less like a celestial event and more like a personal pardon. When he finished, the room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. The youngest grandchild, a girl of about 5, broke the silence. "Was it magic?" she whispered, her eyes huge. Thomas looked at her, then at the old lantern, which now sat on the mantel year-round, a relic. He smiled. "No, darling," he said, his voice thick. "It was a lantern, it was a fire, it was a door that was locked." He paused, finding the words. The magic was in the ordinary things, and in the people who knew how to use them. He looked around the room, at the faces of the family that had grown from that single desperate act of kindness. The magic, he said, was that they chose to share them. The mother reached over and took the father's hand, their fingers, old and knotted, intertwining as naturally as roots. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the world in a gentle, silent white. It was just snow, an ordinary winter night. Inside, the fire burned brightly. The generations were gathered. Stories were told. A lantern, unlit, watched from the mantel, a silent witness to the fact that the most powerful light is not the one that pushes back the storm, but the one that, long after the storm has passed, still burns in the memory and in the lives of those who were warmed by it. And in that quiet, crowded, love-filled room, on a winter night generations removed from the one that started it all, the warmth held. It would always hold.